what I thought would be interesting to do is walk through the Gospels in 3 weeks, and that's a pretty daunting task. But what I want to do is walk through the Gospels from a mindset um, of the background of what makes the Gospels, why they were written, a little bit about the authors themselves, because I think what you'll see is as we go through some of this, as you begin to read the stories again, the narratives, you'll begin to understand them in ways you've never really understood them before. You'll be able to read Luke and begin to understand why Luke writes the way he writes. I don't know how many of you have really sat down and spent time reading through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and seen stories and narratives and thought, well, this is different than I saw here, or why does John only have this miracle, no one else has that miracle, or I thought the order of the stories were different, and we're going to kind of talk about that concept and why that is so important, because it helps us as we move forward is trying to be disciples and understand the scriptures. And then when people have an issue or a question about the Gospels, and I don't know how many of you have ever heard before, but the people have said, well, that the Gospels contradict themselves, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't agree. And so I want to face some of those questions as we go through this session, and as we go for the next couple of weeks, kind of going deeper and deeper every time. And I'm going to kind of start with a how do I say this? I'm gonna start kind of at a high level to begin with, and so we won't be on probably go as deep today, but because I want everybody to kind of get the feel of what this is going to look like. And this session specifically is going to be a little more educational, if that makes any sense. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I've got a little PowerPoint here that's going to help us kind of walk through. So give me a thumbs up. Frank, can you see my screen, Walking with Disciples? All right. So walking with disciples. First of all, we've got to figure out really what are the Gospels. And this may seem very elementary to say that they're biographies of Jesus' earthly life, but that's actually what they are. They're actual biographies. And it's important to understand that the writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as they wrote, they were writing the Gospels to talk about Jesus's life, and being a biography. So what's a biography? Biography is just a story of someone's life. It's telling the story of an individual's life. So when we look at the book, or the books, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we look at a couple things. Number one is that they're narratives and not stories. And a lot of times we'll say the gospel stories. And the reason I point out narratives, and it's important for us to understand, a narrative is an actual story. It actually happened. It's not a fake story. It's not somebody making up something. It's not like our news media today, right? Those are stories, but these are actually narratives. These are things that actually happen. When Jesus heals the blind man, when he comes upon the girl who's dead and brings her back to life, the woman that touches the hem of his, those are actually narratives. They actually happen. They're not made up. And it's important for us, again, to make that distinction within our language as we think about the gospel, the Gospels themselves, that when we're reading through actual things that happen. Okay. The other thing to understand is when we talk about biographies, then we're talking about they're literal and not figurative. And so what I mean by that is that, again, these things actually happen, where throughout the Bible, Genesis all the way through Revelation, there's a lot of moments that are figurative. And a figurative item is a story or an example. And we see it in the Gospels. For example, the parables. Jesus teaches a lot of parables, right? And those are figurative. There's a bigger meaning to that, right? But when we look at, again, at the overall arching stories behind the Gospels themselves, we need to understand these are, again, literal things that happen. And it's interesting because as you go on in the 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 narratives of what's happening, as you move forward in understanding Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, going into Acts and going into Romans, and then all the way through the New Testament, other writings, Paul and everything else that was written, we get to the point where we understand that we need to understand these are literal things, because people would come behind them and try to convince them, like Jesus raising from the dead. They tried to convince people that, oh, you know what, that didn't literally happen. And one of the interesting narratives we find is that there's a moment where Thomas asked to put his hands, right, and touch the scars of Jesus. There's a reason he did that, because he was basically saying, are you literal? Are you figurative, right? Are you actually physically here, or are you a spirit? And that distinction was so important, and we see it throughout. We see Jesus eating after his resurrection. Again, it's a point back to this is a literal resurrection. It's not narrative, nor is it figurative. This actually happened. And as we walk through the New Testament together, as we walk through the Gospels, I want us to always think about, as we read this, these are actually things that happen, and they literally happen. They may have larger meanings. For example, like Jesus transforming the water into wine. If we remember his first miracle there in the wedding story, that was a literal thing. He literally changed water into wine. Now, it had a much bigger meaning than just the fact that he took water and made it into wine, right? But it literally happened. And it's important, again, to understand that as we move forward, that these narratives, these miracles, the teachings, Jesus, calming the seas, though Peter walking on water, those are all literal things that happen, and they're not pointing to anything else. And the reason I make such a distinction here is, again, because people will try to say things like, that didn't literally happen. They're just trying to explain something, and they're using it this way and that way. Next, when we talk about, again, what are the Gospels, we're talking about, again, the biographies of Jesus' earthly life. But what we have to understand is that they were written with a specific purpose in mind. Each of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wrote their section for a specific purpose. And we're going to get into that specific purpose later on as we kind of go through this. But it's helpful for us to understand is each one of them had a different purpose. They didn't have all the same purpose. Yeah, the overarching, the biggest piece is that, again, they're trying to do the biography of Jesus's earthly life, but they had a specific purpose. And then the last thing here on this slide is just they were written with a targeted audience. Okay, so when you think about that, what that tells us is that when they were writing, when John or Matthew, Mark, or Luke, when they were writing, they knew why they were writing, what the purpose of their letters were, right? The gospel was, but they also understood who their audience would be. And that's really, really important to understand, again, as we kind of move forward. Now, off to the right, I think, yeah, to the right, you'll notice these four things, and they may, you might never have seen these before. And I'm going to talk about these in a little bit more understanding as we move forward. But these are the four living creatures. Those of you that kind of know Ezekiel or Revelations or Isaiah talking about the four living creatures, what we find is that through our early church history, that they would associate images to help better understand. So each one of these images actually represents one of the Gospels. So you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we'll see that as we kind of move forward. So I kind of want to give you a reason why these, what may seem like very strange creatures, what they're doing on our screen. As we talked about, each writer had a definite a purpose, a different purpose, right? They all had a different audience, but they also had a different each writer was very different in who they were. Their context was different. You have a tax collector, you've got a historian physician, you've got a fisherman, right? They all come from different backgrounds, different lives. You may not know this, but one of them was Greek. He was from Antioch. So, they have just a total different mindset about each and every one of them. Their relationship with Christ was completely different. You've got John, who is believed to be John the Beloved, who was an inner circle of Jesus, right? There was James and John, the sons of thunder, and Peter. They were in the inner circle. They were the ones that got to spend time with Jesus all the time. So John was written by, they believed was written by who they called John the Apostle or John the Beloved. All right. You have Luke, who probably they believe never met Jesus. Luke was not a disciple of Jesus. Again, Luke was a Greek, grew up in Antioch, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. But obviously, he has a much different relationship than John. John Mark or Mark, again, was not a disciple either. So he wasn't even in with the 12. And then you have Matthew, who was in with the 12. So out of the 4 books of the Bible, or 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 2 of them weren't even disciples of Jesus. One possibly had never even met Jesus writing these. So they had a different relationship, a different viewpoint on who Jesus was and how they understood him. And then again, going back to the concept of, they just had a different purpose for writing. They all believed that they were writing for a specific reason. Okay. And then as we look at the Gospels, one of the things that we need to understand is that 15 to 20% of the Gospels were devoted to 1 week of Jesus's life, the very last week of his life. So as you read through all the pages, the 661 verses in the book of Mark, right? You look at that and you're like, so 20%, almost 20% of that was written all about Jesus's 1 week, that the week of his death and resurrection. So obviously, again, they had a very specific purpose, because at the end of the day, what is the gospel? Yeah, it's the story, it's the narrative of Jesus's life, it's his biography, but it's always pointing to the very good news of that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and he's ascended to the right hand of the Father. So I'm gonna take a quick pause there and just ask if anybody has any questions. Let me make sure that no one has any questions here. Nope. Okay. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of people on, so I wanted to make sure I'm looking at everybody at the same time. Good. All right. Okay. So I'm going to move on. Oh, I got to share my screen. Sorry. Does Debbie have a question?
I am noticing this from Acts all the way over to John is when he stopped talking, and he didn't talk to nobody else until we got in Revelation. Why was that?
Who hadn't talked to anybody?
Jesus talked to these people, Mark, Luke, and John. He talked to them, but he didn't speak to nobody else in between until they got in Revelation.
Well, he talked to Paul, right, on the road to Damascus.
Okay.
Right. But he says, and he tells us that, hey, I have to leave and I'm going to send someone else. I'm going to send the comforter.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Okay.
That's a good question. Any other questions? That's a good question. All right. Let me get back to, there it is. Share my screen. Okay. Can we see Matthew? We see a picture of a guy in like a pedestal or something. Yes? No? Hi, Isaac. Okay. All right. I get a thumb up. Okay. So I want to take, and now we're just going to kind of switch gears a little bit. We already talked about the Gospels. Let's talk about the writers themselves. And again, this is important, right? So I don't know how many of you knew that 2 of them were not disciples of Christ, or at least were not part of the 12, the original 12. I don't know how many of you knew that. So when we look at Matthew, Matthew is referred to as Levi in the books of Mark and Luke. So in the book of Matthew, he's called Matthew, but in the book of Mark and Luke, he's actually called Levi. Which what do we know, and why would his name change? Well, one of the things we understand about a name change is that anytime they spent time with God, that we would see people change their names. Abram became Abraham, right? Peter, he didn't start out Saul to Paul, right? So when we it was Simeon and Peter, right? So it changed there. So Luke and Mark, who again, Luke being a Greek man from Antioch, and then John Mark, who was, or again, he's references Mark here, John Mark. We know about him in the book of Acts. Okay, so they referenced him as Levi. We know him as a tax collector. He was called on the road. Jesus called him. It tells us a couple things about Matthew himself. It meant he would have been in higher education, right? A lot of the disciples, they were fishermen. Okay, where here we've got, I'm going to pause for a second. I may have a question here. Did he disappear? No, he took his question down. Okay, right. So he had a higher standing within the Roman world then. Okay, they would have looked at him, and he would have, because he worked for King Herod, and he worked for the Romans. But on the opposite side, he had a lower standing within the Jewish world, meaning basically the Jewish individuals thought of him poorly, even just like we do the IRS, right? Who nobody likes the IRS. Well, that would be kind of similar to what we would look at Matthew if we were in that, because he was taxing his own people and giving those funds to King Herod. So whether he was doing it correctly, if he was being good about what he was doing or not, it didn't really matter. They looked at him in a bad light. We know that Matthew, near the end of his life, he actually became a missionary to Ethiopia, and there died. There's 2 different stories, both of which point to his death in Ethiopia, where he was a missionary. One, the one that's believed the most is that he was impaled to the earth by spears. Right? That's a pretty kind of rough life there. Another one is that he was stabbed in the back, actually by the king of Ethiopia's one of his servants, because he was speaking against what the king of Ethiopia was doing. So we kind of understanding now the background of who Matthew is. When we go to look at the scriptures, when we start reading Matthew, we're going to read it a little differently because we understand his educational background, who he was, what people thought of him, and how he grew up, right? Because then if we look at Mark again was not one of the 12 disciples. He may have been one of the 72. Not everybody understands that, but Jesus had more than 12 disciples. Jesus had the main 12, and then we read later on about him sending out the 72, right? And there were others. And if we remember in the book of Acts, that in the upper room, we see 120 individuals. So There were a ton more followers, but again, Mark, or John Mark, as he's referred to in the book of Acts, was not one of the 12 disciples. Mark is first talked about in the book of Acts itself, and we hear about him first with Paul and Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas are going on a missionary journey, kind of the first major missionary journey, and John Mark actually goes with him, goes with them along the way, but at some point he turns back, and as he turns back, that's when the split between Paul and Barnabas happens. If we kind of remember the story a little bit, that Paul and Barnabas disagreed. They were about ready to go on another journey. Barnabas wanted to take John Mark. Paul said, no, I don't want to. So Barnabas takes John Mark and goes on his way, and Paul grabs somebody, and I just blanked on his name. Paul grabs someone else, and he goes on his journey. And then there's a reconciliation that happens in the end of Acts. We actually hear Paul talking very highly about John Mark and the ministry that he was doing. John Mark's an interesting individual because we know or believe that we know that he was a really good close friend of Peter, and Peter's probably then therefore the one that really brought him into the relationship with Jesus Christ. An interesting thing about John Mark is we find John Mark's mother mentioned in Acts chapter 12. And if we remember the story, so Peter's in prison, and the church at John Mark's mother's house is meeting, and they're praying. And if we kind of remember that story in Acts chapter 12, an angel comes, wakes Peter up, pulls him, basically walks him out of prison, and he goes to the door of John Mark's house, mom's house, knocks on the door, and the servant girl comes to the door but doesn't open it, recognizes his voice, and then runs and tells everybody, hey, Peter's at the door, if you kind of remember that story at all. Now, that's interesting because it tells us a little bit about that relationship, again, between Peter and John Mark, and obviously John Mark's mother. Okay. Many theologians actually then point to John, it's funny to say this, John Mark's mother's house as the place where the Last Supper actually took place. So we see a lot of references there. So again, John Mark might not have been one of the 12 disciples, but he was very, very close to Peter, and more than likely had spent time with Jesus. Mark ended his life in AD 68. He was killed on Easter Sunday, and when he was dragged by a horse to his death, as he was grabbed by the Romans. And during the martyrdom, if we understand of all the disciples, the 12 main disciples, and again, Mark was not one of those, but of the 12 main disciples, almost every single one of them died, were martyred for their beliefs. But also in this time frame within Jerusalem, there was a lot of killing of Jewish individuals, which actually led to a Jewish revolt not too long after this. So Luke again, I think is an interesting one to a lot of us when we really think about this. Again, not one of the 12 disciples. He's known as a historian and a physician. And we can see that if we really pay attention to Luke's writings, because when Luke writes, you will notice that he writes a lot about names, where other Matthew and Mark, they may leave the names of individuals out. Luke is very specific on how he writes the scriptures, and with the details in which he puts in there. In fact, Luke is also the one that did it in chronological order, meaning that he took a lot of time to put the years that he put together of Jesus's life in chronological order, meaning from the order in which they happen. Where Matthew, Mark, and John don't do that. they have a specific purpose, and they actually take narratives, they take things that have happened and they put them together in different timing. Where Luke, if we read the story of Luke, he's very geographic and very chronological. So in other words, he's really pointing us, hey, we're going here at this time, and this is what we're doing. Again, he's a Gentile, which is very interesting when you think about the starting of the Christianity, that you've got a Gentile who writes one of the Gospels, and a Greek who was believed to grow up in Antioch. And those of you that know the book of Acts, he wrote the book of Acts. We know that he actually titles it that way. And Antioch plays a huge role in the book of Acts. It's mentioned multiple times in the book of Acts. In fact, the name Christianity is first mentioned in the same time as talking about Antioch. They were called Christians in Antioch. Paul, we also know, or I'm sorry, Luke, we also know traveled with Paul on many of his missionary trips. So he spent a lot of time with Paul going throughout. And, so the belief there, the thought there is he probably was one of the first Christians from Antioch as Paul has gone out, or as the disciples have gone out and begin to preach the word, that Luke at one point heard and joined forces. Luke actually died at the age of 84, which is very late for anybody in that age group or that era to live that long. But he died very, very old individual. And the last guy then is John. John's again another very interesting character in the Bible, because there's a lot of Johns. Brother Frank, you and I have talked about this. There's a lot of Johns in the Bible. Obviously we have John the Baptist, who starts the whole thing. We have John the Beloved. We have John, who they call the Revelator. We have John, the brother of James, John the Presbyter. There's multiple Johns, right? So it's very difficult with some of the writings to know who wrote them, because they're not named. Okay, so when you read the book of Matthew, Mark, right, Luke, you're not going to read their names anywhere and say, hey, I'm writing this. Now, some of the Pauline letters, we have that, that, hey, this is Paul, I'm writing this. But John doesn't, again, like most of the Gospels, like all the Gospels, doesn't really mention his name. We have some background to understand who's writing it, because in the book of John, John, the brother of James, again, the sons of Zebedee, him, James, and Peter would spend a lot of time together. John, in the book of John, would refer to himself or the other individual as the one that Jesus loved. And so we're pretty positive that John the Beloved, again, the brother of James, who are the same person, was the writer of John. What we don't know is he also the writer of Revelations, and or is he the writer of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, right? So the writer of Revelations, also called John the Revelator, obviously the last book of the Bible, and the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John that come near the end of the New Testament. None of those are referenced. John in the book of Revelations does say it's John that's writing, but he doesn't refer to himself as John the Beloved at that point, or point as to who it is. So there's some of those things where we're just not totally sure who wrote those, which John it was. Again, John's a very, very regular or normal name, kind of like it is today in our world. But for our purposes, we look through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we can be pretty sure that John the Beloved wrote this, because again, how he referenced himself and who that was. It was believed that he died at an old age. So out of the 12 disciples, he's the only one they believe that was not martyred at any point. There was I think it's an interesting story. And I call it a story, not a narrative, a story because it's not been proved. Um, but the story of him being thrown in a vat of boiling oil in a Colosseum, and which was again one of the ways that they would martyr individuals. They would kill them, but he came out unharmed. And the story goes that the whole Colosseum accepted Jesus Christ at that moment and turned. What's interesting about John 2 is that not that you probably don't know who these guys are or have heard of them before, but he was the teacher, the direct teacher of two of the most profound early theologians of Polycarp and Ignatius. So these two are individuals that we've learned a ton about of the Bible, a ton about the New Testament and the new church and how the church functioned. So I'm gonna pause for another second here, stop my sharing, and just make sure no one has any questions. I've covered a whole bunch there.
Did you get my chat question?
Oh, there we go. All right. Great question. So Don was asking about Matthew, how he was educated. He was educated, whether he was educated by the Roman government. That's actually a twofold answer. It's a yes and no. So just like any other Jewish child, he would have been raised up till the age of 13, and then at 13 made that decision on what he wanted to do. And if he was seen as somebody religiously important, he would have been grabbed by a rabbi. But at this point, he more than likely would have followed his family. The lineage there seems like his family was in that. So it would have been trained from his parents, again, who were trained by the Roman government. So which meant that he was very well spoken, understood and spoke Greek very well, which is the main language. Obviously, as we read the New Testament, I think you've heard me talk about it. Greek is the main language of the New Testament. Aramaic is another language that's spoken very rarely. But if we look at like Matthew and Mark, and we look at the language spoken or written in Matthew and Mark, Matthew would have used proper Greek, or not would have used proper Greek in everything he wrote. Where Mark, who was a fisherman, I didn't mention that. John Mark was also a fisherman. He used conversational Greek, and so when you compare the Greek to Greek, you could see the education, right? And in fact, Luke, again, who was highly educated and also a Greek individual, you look at those three letters combined, and we'll talk about why those three are so important. The three Gospels, you see Matthew and Luke using the same grammar, and then Mark using anything but that grammar. He pulled for I'll do this for Dave. He went a little hillbilly on it with his Greek language. But that's a great question, because it helps us understand Matthew a little bit better, because Matthew had a great relationship with the Romans. So he understood his place in the world. Anyone else? Frank, hold on a second.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you should be good to go.
I think that's where we get the word walking with disciples. They was like a trailblazers. They was in the front of the 12 disciples. They went to places and kind of prepared Sauk Village that Jesus is coming. This is what their job was. That's why, and going out and not like that. Now that's the way I'm understanding this, is when they say it was not in his inner circle, but they went out in the front of the disciples and him, in the front of the disciples, and kind of laid the way for them to get there. So when they, when they come to a place, they would already be prepared to say, well, Jesus is coming. And if I ask who Jesus was, they could be able to tell it.
Yeah, it's an interesting, as we next week I want to get into the book specifically,
Okay.
and so you're going to see that a little bit more as we dive into them, because what you'll notice is that they weren't written in 30 AD or 33 AD or 26 AD, right? They were actually written 50, 60, 70, 80 AD, after, so years after the death and resurrection of Christ. And so and we'll talk about, well, how did they get there? How did it work? How did we even get the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? How did that come about? And I think I know I find everything interesting, but I think it's a really interesting concept as we move forward and look at this. That I think sometimes we think way too American, we think way too 2020, and think about like, well, they were just YouTubing or Facebook Live, or that's how they shared everything, or they were walking around. And what we forget about are for them to write anything, they had to write it on parchment. Parchment was very expensive, very fragile, and these rolls, they call them parchment rolls, would be very large. I don't know if I can try to, I mean, you can think about like shoulder length, width, or bigger, depending on what they were doing. And they couldn't have even the whole Bible, nor could they even have all the Gospels on them. They would have one parchment. If it would contain the whole of one of the Gospels. You might find the parchment of maybe Mark, and to be able to travel with that, again, was something very, very fragile, was very difficult for them to be able to take massive portions of Scripture. Today, you and I are blessed because at any second I can go online, or I can go grab one of my 50 Bibles over on my bookshelf, and I can find anything I want to there. They just didn't have that. And so if you think about that concept, that we'll talk about it. We'll just say 26 AD. We'll say 30. We'll make it easy. 30 AD, death and resurrection of Christ, he ascends into heaven. So you're talking 20 to 30 years later, roughly, that the Gospels are written. But what's happened in those 20 or 30 years? Well, the message of Jesus Christ has gone everywhere in that amount of time without even the Gospels being written. Oh, here's another question. So the question is, if they weren't all disciples, what was the connection, and why did Jesus instill a love and trust into them, but not enough to be disciples? Okay, great question. So, a couple things. Number one, Luke is a Greek, right? He was a Greek man, again, and more than likely didn't even receive Jesus Christ until after his death and resurrection. And so in that kind of scenario, he would have never even had the opportunity. Jesus also tells us in the Gospels, at one point he's talking to a woman who is not a Jewish individual, and said that basically he was not called at that point to the Gentiles. He was called to the nation of Israel, the Jewish nation. And so Jesus' focus while on earth was purely to the Jewish individuals. John Mark, what was his connection? Again, more than likely his connection was fairly close, but through Peter. And he saw something in him. God saw something in him at some point to breathe on him and say, I want you to write this. And we'll talk a little bit more about it. But the belief is that John Mark's letter is actually a dictation of Peter, that near Peter's death, close to his death in the late stages of the 60s, 60 AD, that Peter was dictating to John Mark. And so the stories within the book of Mark, again, Mark and Peter both being fishermen, that Mark was actually writing for Peter. So I hope that kind of helps answer that question. Any other questions?
No, I have no question.
Okay. All right. So last thing, I say very quickly, I want to set the stage for next week, right? And what I want to set the stage with, I'm going to share my screen one more time here. And this may kind of again, we're talking about the four living creatures. All right. Can everyone see the four living creatures there? So we see the four living creatures multiple times throughout the Bible. This section is taken out of the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 10, and he describes the four living creatures. We also see them again in Isaiah. We see them in Revelation. We see them in Daniel, the four living creatures that are continually before the throne. And it talks about the four living creatures, and they have different faces. One, the face of a lion, one, the face of an ox, face of a man, and the face of an eagle. The purpose of the four living creatures is about bringing glory and honor to God. They're always before the throne. They're about the throne of God, the sovereignty of who God is. And each animal, in this case, there's also a man who is an animal. Each animal represents something very, very different. And what they believed. And you saw, again, we started off with a picture of the four living creatures, that each one of the books of the Gospels are written to bring glory to God, and they're written in the form of one of the creatures. For example, Matthew was written, and his symbol has been symbolized as human. As the human face. Mark is symbolized by the lion. Luke is symbolized by the ox, and John is symbolized by the eagle. We're not going to get into why at this point. Next week we'll talk about the why. But what we see, and I'm going to scroll back, you'll notice John here, he's got a little eagle on his side. Luke, again, he's got the ox. Mark, lion. And then Matthew with the human face. Okay, it's what's interesting about this again is the theology behind what was happening, what they were trying to teach individuals. Because again, as we think about it, they didn't have the Bible like we have it today. They weren't able to share it, but they would talk, and there was an understanding behind the animals themselves. What does the lion mean? What does the ox mean? And what does it mean when they're trying to glorify God? Or in this case, they're glorifying Jesus, the Son of God. What does that look like? Matthew with the human face, and again, John with the eagle. What does that all look like? And each of the writers, as God breathed on them, the concept or the thought here is that they are doing the same thing as the four living creatures that are doing in heaven right now, right? They are meant to glorify the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They're meant to illuminate the glory of what God is. And so when we look at the four Gospels, we look in that mindset to understand that not one gospel, not one narrative, not one story alone could tell the breadth and the width and the height and the depth of the glory of Jesus. That it would take much more than that. And not only would take much more than that, but it had to take it and from a different angle, a different look. And the four living creatures, as we look in Revelations or Daniel or Isaiah or Ezekiel, we see them always glorifying the Father, always around the throne. And that these four Gospels have that same concept, overall concept, and each one is associated again with a different animal, or different, let me say, a different face. Because in some of the prophecies, These are prophecies, the visions of heaven, right? That the four living creatures actually had four faces as well. They each would have the same face, but we kind of see this illustration in Ezekiel talks about each living creature having its own face. So I'm not going to get any deeper into it than that. I just kind of want to set the stage for next week, because next week what I want to do is I want to go and dive into actually the gospel writings themselves. I want to talk about why Matthew is related to the human face. What does that mean? What does it mean that John is the eagle, and Luke's an ox, and why Mark is the way Mark is? So let me stop this, and we're gonna stop the share, and I'm gonna pause for any questions. So any questions? I hope I didn't. Yes, Donovan. I think you have to unmute yourself there. Hey Donovan, can you unmute?
I'm sorry. Are these narratives or near eyewitnesses? And when I say near eyewitnesses, sometimes the author, I don't think the authors were there, but they were nearby or in the area. But the question is, are these narratives were stories told long after to the authors?
That's a great question. And so let's talk about John really quickly. So everything in John that we see, he was a firsthand witness of those, right? Wherever Jesus went, John was with him, right? So we can say John right away, okay, he's good to go. But then you've got John, Mark, and Luke, and you're like, wait, they weren't even disciples. Did they really be able to spend that much time with them? And again, Luke, he was in Antioch the whole time that Jesus was alive. What happened to him, right? And how would that work? So there's a couple things there, and I don't want to get too deep in this, but Luke, when Luke writes, he writes that he, like a good historian would do, actually went out and sought eyewitnesses. That he went to people and asked them, tell me about this. Tell me about this miracle. Tell me about what Jesus said here or there. So Luke was very specific about that, again, because he's an historian. And so he's very, very cautious and made sure that everything he wrote was actually truth, right? Was backed up. John Mark, again, it's believed that everything that he writes was actually told to him by Peter, another one of the inner circle. So it would have been a firsthand account at that writing. Matthew, who was a disciple, one of the 12, again, more than likely spent the majority of time with Jesus. But we'll notice as we get into some of the narratives that we won't see the same narrative in each story or each gospel. And we don't see the same narrative in each story or gospel, right? I gotta get that word story out of my head, right? The gospel, because they weren't there. And that's one of the things that makes the gospel so interesting, is if they couldn't prove it, or if they weren't there, like Luke couldn't prove it, because he couldn't find an eyewitness firsthand account, he didn't include it. Matthew has done some of the same things. John, for example, John talks about Lazarus. No one else talks about Lazarus. Well, why is that? That was pretty big, right? That was a big story, and yet we don't see it in the preceding gospels. The belief is, can't ask them, but the belief is because they didn't have first-hand accounts of exactly how that happened. I don't know. Does that help? Does that kind of answer that question a little bit?
Yeah, that helps.
Because then next week we'll talk about something called Q, and the letter Q, and that is it's a collection of Jesus' sayings. So we talked about that they couldn't bring the Gospels along, but like any good rabbi, Jesus would have had somebody at some point who would have been writing down a lot of his sayings. So there is a document that theologians refer to as Q. We'll talk a little bit more about that one, where that's out, where that came from, and again how do the narratives of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John come together. Great question.